Well, hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming along today. So first off, I want this presentation to be as accessible as possible. So apologies if I explain certain terminologies or shorthands that seem obvious or basic. It's just to make sure that everyone knows what I'm actually talking about. Additionally, if I say anything and you're not sure what I've just said or what it means, just pop your hand up or ask at the end and I will happily explain anything. Guaranteed others will be wondering the same if there's anything you're unsure of. And the presentation is also by no means a comprehensive concept art talk, largely so we actually have some time for Q&A at the end if anyone would like. So I'd rather just leave a little bit of time at the end on concept art in general, or anything touched on in the following slides that anyone wants to talk about at all. But overall, I'm hoping to give just a good insight into the production of our last game, Disney Illusion Island, because games and their actual pipelines and the way they're made are often shrouded in lots of mystery. So just a quick bit about me. My name is Rory, and I'm currently the senior concept artist at Dlala Studios in Essex. I'm originally from Scotland, studied computer arts at Aberdeen and Dundee, and my favourite game is either Fallout 3 or Wind Waker or Gone Home, depending on what mood you catch me in on any given day. And also for the past couple of years, I've been living in Norwich, and I absolutely love it here, so it's great to be part of this rejuvenated Norwich Games Festival. I also have a particular fondness for the Millennium Library, so I'm very pleased to be presenting to you here today from this building. As someone who grew up in council housing and a single parent household, I'm also deeply committed to helping people from different backgrounds get into games. So I've done panels with BAFTA Guru for their young game designers, some stuff with GI Biz Academy, interviews with Barclays, new outreach program, and then some panels and masterclasses for Into Games, which I highly recommend checking out if you're interested in pursuing a career in game development. And then also some mentoring through the Limit Break scheme, which I'd also recommend. And I've also spoken at places like Develop in Brighton, Arts University Bournemouth, and some various other random events. So moving on, what do I do at Dlala? What do we do as a company? What is the brand? Just to basically highlight the general space that I'll sort of be coming from during this talk. We make playable cartoons. I just wanted to check, see if has anyone played Battletoads or Illusion Island at all? Yeah, people. Awesome. Okay, that gives me an idea how much detail I go into here. So yeah, I was a concept artist and a production artist and an implementation artist on Battletoads 2020 for Xbox One. For those who don't know, like the original Battletoads, ours also contained multiple genres of gameplay, 11 to be exact, which was nuts, each with their own unique pitfalls. I do actually have a talk breaking down all those as well, that I can link to anyone if they want to see it afterwards. It's only available through a private link at the moment. Gave that in 2021 after we shipped. And then I was promoted to senior concept artist on Illusion Island for the Switch, and then we actually had much more time to develop the world building for this game during pre-production. So I'm really excited to share some artwork from it publicly for the first time. And I would also like to add a standard art talk disclaimer that there are no absolutes when it comes to creating art. And I will be coming from like a very specific perspective of a 2D artist from a small/medium-sized studio, which exists basically to make hand-drawn, traditionally animated 2D stylized cartoony games. So very specific perspective. So don't take anything I say as like a universal games truth. However, there's always room for overlap if that's not your thing. So I'm hoping that some of the lessons today will help clarify the general challenges as well for creating art for games that resonates and what you can do to help your own game art sing. And I would also like to add to that that although in this talk I do focus very much like from my own perspective and a lot of my own work, I was like one of a bunch of much more talented artists that worked on this game to make it as beautiful as it ended up being, most of whom you can see here either like in person or projected onto that Google Meet in the background. So starting at the absolute basics, what is the role of a concept artist? When I first started perceiving concept art as a thing, when I was first starting uni, I basically thought that this slightly dated meme now was what I was heading towards. But as hilarious as this slightly dated meme is, it's only half true. At least in my experience, the job, much like all of us, contains multitudes. One thing that's key to the role, at least in my experience, is the ability to be a bit of a creative chameleon. So as a concept artist, you serve an extremely important role in essentially helping to develop the soul of the game. So you can have an influence on the music, on the user interface, on the writing, and even on the core gameplay itself. So being able to essentially sort of cosplay as a designer, composer, writer has been a skill that I've sort of actively looked to develop over my career so far. And then being able to communicate a wider vision beyond just like, here's my art, this looks cool to the team, is like an essential, sort of extremely valuable, fulfilling part of the job as well. So what I hope you'll get from this talk. So firstly, I'm going to walk through how we built some of our visual foundation on Illusion Island during pre-production, what worked really well for us and had the best results, and how we crafted our art bible. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the common pitfalls that I've experienced, having now been around a few dev cycles on 2D games. And then after that, I'll chat a little bit about portfolios for getting into games, how we sort of process them at Dlala, and then some of my own like personal preferences for them, and some vibe stuff. And then hopefully we can have a little chat at the end and answer any questions you might have about concept art, anything at all. And yeah, I also thought it would be fun to sort of watch the trailer first, so that everyone has so that every single person sort of has more context for the artwork, the information and talk, and to just like get a feel for the rough like tone and plot and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully this will work.
Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, we bid you welcome to the world of Monoth!
Tell us what you need, Toku.
Our entire world is in danger. You must travel to the 3 biomes of Monoth and retrieve the Hooves of Knowledge.
If others are in need, we should help them.
Don't you worry, Toku. We'll do it.
Hang on! The books are gone!
It's okay. We'll explain.
TBD! TBD! TBD!
Wait, are those placeholder words or the actual words?
Yes.
Adorable. Okay. So yeah, the game is a 4-player, family-friendly, combat-free Metroidvania, or as we often refer to it, a Mickeyvania. So we wanted to channel the sort of charm and magic of a lot of the older kind of 90s Mickey Mouse games, Mickey Mania, all those sort of ones, and then utilize that to sort of introduce younger players to the like very typically inaccessible Metroidvania genre. And what got Disney excited initially was our pitch that we wanted to make a world with the soul of Disney World, and the attention to detail and the flowing, pleasing compositions and the way the worlds unfold around you. We wanted telling stories, theming and appealing compositions to be at the heart of everything we did. So that was our guiding mantra for the project's art as a whole. We wanted to create a world with the perfect balance of readability and intrigue, looking for opportunities to tell stories when we could, and knowing when to let environments take a back seat. We wanted our shapes and proportions to be aimed generally at younger audiences, but that can still have an edge to them. And we wanted to create new biomes or worlds that you don't typically see in 2D platformers. So instead of your sort of level 1 forest, level 2 desert, etc., we have our botany biome here that you can see, which has seemingly evolved on the back of an enormous peahen, with inspiration taken from things like Japanese gardens, Victorian menageries, and smuggler trails. Our astronomy biome, which combines forgotten seaside, cute little village towns with outer space, and also our engineering biome, a Rube Goldberg experiment blown up to city scale. So on Illusion Island, we had around 9 months of pre-production time. For the art team, most of this was spent developing the visual style, designing the characters, and then slowly crafting the art Bible style guide sort of towards the end, before spending the remaining few months creating a vertical slice, which is a sort of small section of the game that sort of demonstrates the benchmark or the quality bar that you're going to be aiming for the wider game. And that's not the case on every project that you'll do that, but it's often the case when there's like a publisher or sort of big client involved that wants to see what they're buying into. So in our case, Disney, obviously. And yeah, I figured it would be really useful to just talk about this period of time in game development, because it's often the most gatekept, as by nature it shows a lot of stuff which doesn't represent the final product at all. So it can seem like undesirable, to want to share it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's like the most interesting stuff, the stuff you sort of had to create in order to get to the next thing, and to get to the final thing eventually. So the ideas you basically realized weren't quite it, but nonetheless informed the final outcome in their own sort of unique, special ways. And from that eventual art Bible that we created, there are a few key sections that I'd like to just focus on that I think are sort of the most important and interesting on this game, and hopefully the most beneficial to hear about as well. So those are finding our references, building our shape language, figuring out our levels of detail, creating our brushes, our Photoshop brushes, our rendering style and pipeline, and then also some general resources that I think are just really good to consider for art Bibles. And although as I said, I'm not going to go through the entire art Bible today because that would take forever, but I would just like to sort of stress how useful it is to be as creative as possible with the bases that you do cover in your art Bibles, because the more bases you cover, the less likely you'll sort of be redoing or repainting assets. Some of you might be aware of, I don't know if you know the game Fez. So it's the Fez problem that sort of Phil Fish faced on that, where he kept sort of figuring out new sort of angles of his art style as he was making it. So he ended up having to like redo the art for the game about 5 times, because by the time he got to the end, it's like look back at the start and it's like, oh, I can do this so much better now, I'll go back to the start. And then that kept happening until it got to the point where it's like, no, we need to just release this game. So taking as much time as you can to sort of answer as specifically as possible, what does that art style mean, what does it look like, can help minimize any exposure to the Fez problem. So first off, this obviously wouldn't be an art talk without the traditional bit on the importance of good reference. I'm not going to go on about it too much because I'm sure a lot of you might be aware how to gather reference, why it's important. So apologies if any of it's super basic again. But I did want to just touch on a few very specific aspects of things that I swear by, and hopefully might help improve your own practice. First one's literally just books. But I feel this is still worth focusing on because the amount of times I've sat on Google or Pinterest or even like Adobe Stock or something like that, and just not found kind of what I was looking for, not found the inspiration I was looking for, is like a genuine problem. And I just can't recommend going to any secondhand bookshop and looking around their architecture or fashion or natural history section for the most inspirational things you could ever hope to find. Shockingly, these items that have been lovingly curated by actual human professionals are often more useful than sort of using the internet to gather some reference, and really helpful for finding new avenues to explore. And then additionally, of course, if you have access, a library card is also an invaluable tool for us, as you can only fill your place with so many books. And books aren't always cheap, especially these nice, pretty art books. And yet also remember to pester your uni or your college library to get in the books you want rather than having to buy them as well. I definitely underutilized that when I was at uni. And look into the world of fashion is another example of something we leaned on. So combining unexpected textures and materials was a huge part of creating the unique looks for each of the biomes in Mono. And these Alexander McQueen dresses here were like a really good North Star for us early on. Naturally, a lot of character designers will really lean on like the fashion world a lot, but even as an environment artist, you can really like look into the choices and ideas behind a lot of these sort of costumes and outfits, sort of like on the runway, can be really great unexpected sources of inspiration. and I'd specifically recommend First View, especially for this sort of reference gathering. They allow you to sort of sort by like designer, country, season, and more, so you can really like dial in on that specific era that you might be interested in developing. Thirdly, one of the most useful tools that I've found for the more everyday, mundane references is Google Street View. As I mentioned before, replicating that Disneyland feeling of like an organic, interconnected world that seamlessly flows together and whose narratives slowly reveal themselves to you was a core pillar of the game. So being able to virtually walk around the space and view things from multiple angles was really priceless. And obviously you could just like Google Tomorrowland or whatever, Disneyland in Google Images, but what you get are sort of the kind of PR approved pictures of Tomorrowland, whereas in Google Maps you can kind of like wander around and look at the things you're not supposed to see, like the bins and dumpsters and all that sort of stuff, or how the Imagineers have sort of like carefully disguised this, like the seating or the waiting areas, or even like safety information into the actual set design itself, and that like attention to detail really raises the bar for sort of how immersive these environments are. And another thing I highly encourage is to be as focused as possible with your mood boards. So mood boards don't even need to be project specific either. I'd really recommend keeping a mood board of your own personal tastes, things that speak to you directly and specifically for what reason. So on Illusion Island, we established these mood boards for the specific type of line work that we wanted. The way environments can be used to highlight characters, the relationship of proportions in certain artists' work that we thought felt right for our world, and even the sort of sense of adventure that can be felt in certain comic books as you transition from foreground to off into the background. And slowly we sort of pieced together and cherry-picked very specific ideas that we could to then begin sort of like making our own little potion. And yeah, when it comes to choosing each section, don't feel like you just have to do the sort of the usual things that you might expect, sort of just like vehicles, weapons, environments. I really think lending some time to the less exciting things, oddly, in the world really bulks up your reference and works wonders down the line for production art. So like the mundane things are what really sell an environment and like help believability, and so like in turn encourages immersion. So you really don't want to get them wrong. And this to me sort of sums up why I feel bathrooms in games are so important and underrated. Because obviously no one needs to use the toilet in a video game, but when they're there, your brain just sort of subconsciously says to itself, like, ah yes, like a toilet, this must be real, I shall be immersed now. Shape language, my fave. So this is a diagram from of some Cinderella artwork from the art of Tangled that I really leaned on heavily in my own undergrad, and then actually used a lot of this in my dissertation in the end. And these were brought up when we were having our initial conversations during pre-production on Illusion Island. Cinderella was like a really great example of using a really simple collection of signature shapes to create a very distinct feeling. So this technique lends the film both like a beautiful flowing rhythm and an intimate framing and sense of bracketing in the viewer to sort of frame the action of each shot in a meaningful and intimate way. And we really responded to this as a team and sort of strived to create our own palette of shapes that would sort of maintain the classic charm of Cinderella whilst complementing our gameplay and also like the flowing lines and shapes of Monoth, and then also utilize it to hopefully frame some of our key moments really effectively as well. So at the very start of the project, or pretty early in, I did these shape warm-ups in Photoshop, like most mornings, which I found really incredibly useful. So once we'd made inroads in the types of shapes that we felt suited the game, gaining that muscle memory for these shapes was really essential for developing the style at the pace that we wanted. These only took about like five minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but it's amazing how sort of effective this exercise is in encouraging these shapes to sort of come out in your work afterwards, and so it really helps to unify the visual language really well. And then we'd also learned previously on Battletoads to sort of have that essential shapes library ready to go for a growing team that always happens on games. Because it's just like extremely beneficial in abstracting down the sort of visual style into component parts, so that people, when they're being onboarded, it can be like could be sort of less of a struggle. Can get them on board nice and quick. Time exercises. So again, very early into pre-production here, we experimented with thumbnailing with extremely tight time constraints. These were some of the earliest ones that I could find. And I think we had about 60 seconds or so to do each one of these. And so like some were based on just a random reference photo that we sort of had, and then we'd have to just translate. But a lot of them were just sort of the brief from our art director Lucy was just do 10 thumbnails or do 8 thumbnails based on with like an environment with a castle, and so you could just have that loose parameter to go from. And these as well are really, really surprisingly good at building up your shape language. So the useful thing about these timed thumbnail experiments is it really forces your brain to focus on the readability of everything. So you know when you're doing, say like that second one, like that tree in the second one from the top, I had like 5 seconds maybe to do it. So it's like, what is this? How am I going to make this look? I've got 5 seconds to do it. It needs to be readable as a tree at the end of it. And then the same applies to the clouds and the houses and like everything. So you're kind of forced. So yeah, in turn, it allows you to sort of slowly start curating a unique palette of shapes that you sort of force out of yourself that you didn't know were in there. And then also like silhouettes as well that you just might not have otherwise landed on. Abstract experiments. I put abstract experiments, but I think a good way to categorize these ones is Rorschach thumbnails. So these are really useful in the same way that Rorschach tests are really useful. They give your brain a very tight parameter to project onto, and you sort of tease it out from there. And these also really worked really well as team experiments for us, to sort of pass around between the artists. So myself and then another artist, Yonje Dlala, did this one together. So she sort of gave me like just these kind of quick blobs, and then I just sort of threw some detail over the top, and then vice versa for me to her. I did some ugly blobs and then sent over to her, and she made a masterpiece. It was great. And so yeah, these are like really, really great creative fuels to pass between yourself and other artists, or even like fellow students if you're studying. So yeah, just handing over simple shapes that you've come up with, and then seeing how another artist interprets them is a really, really useful way to just sort of like wake up your brain and sort of remind it that not everyone sees something different, even in really, really simple things. Proportions. So everyone has their comfort food, and this is mine. Some people's thing is like line or color or anatomy, but I always gravitate towards shapes and their proportions for probably too long. And we established a huge against tiny rule on Illusion Island, which sort of kind of starts coming through a little bit here on 2 and 4. You can sort of see that sort of contrast. We were looking at a lot of Paul Richards' work at the time, and the proportions are just so instantly like recognizable and iconic. And they're also sort of pushed to that perfect level where it doesn't feel surreal or abstract or like unbelievable. Like these couldn't sort of support their own weight or anything, but they're still so full of character and so playful. So this was like a perfect little ingredient that we sort of chucked in our pot. And I think that's just like a really important way to think about these sort of things, I find, or visual styles in general. You're essentially taking individual ingredients from elsewhere and then creating your own recipe out of all those little pieces in a specific way that no one else has ever thought of doing. And only your individual taste and your team's taste can actually make those decisions, which kind of ties back nicely to kind of what I was saying earlier about grabbing your own sort of mood board just to understand and your own tastes better. And these were some early thumbnails I created looking back, sort of to bank on the sort of simple charm from our early tests and thumbnails, So at this stage, I'm just like dialing in a little bit further here, trying to keep readability in mind, but also looking to incorporate some of our signature shapes, satisfying proportions, and starting to figure out how different scales kind of feel in our world with our main character, who we now had at this point designed. So there's a couple of elements here that we did pick up and which are in the final game, but we also didn't feel that these as a whole were sort of truly leaning into our core ethos like well enough, which was the joy of movement. So if we walk it forward just a couple of weeks, you can see more dynamism sort of coming into play here. I'm trying to use the shapes to sort of complement the feeling of the momentum itself in the world, and as well as trying to establish a vocabulary of shapes and proportions that encourage a feeling of exploration, taking leaps of faith, and essentially parkour. So yeah, one of the challenges of this game as well that I sort of touched on briefly, and something we really had to reckon with on Battletoads as well, was readability. Readability matters in every game, but in this game especially, we knew that with potentially 4 players all running around on the screen, platforming and solving puzzles at once, it was absolutely paramount that the environment art bars that we set took all of that into account. So with that in mind, I made sure to drop in 4 sort of mock-up placeholder characters into the concept art as soon as I sort of could, because obviously our characters weren't fully designed at this point. We knew that we were going to be dealing with 4 unique players on screen eventually, so it just made sense to take the full thing into account. Brushes. So yeah, this is Photoshop brushes specifically for us. So during pre-production for both Battletoads and Illusion Island, we crafted a really small select palette of brushes. These are typically 2 to 3 main brushes and then a supplementary one that would be sort of sparingly used for certain kind of details, or like flares, like for scuffs or for rust or for those kind of things. And keeping your brush palette limited is a really, really useful way to keep your world cohesive. And when you start working with teams in industry, which in my experience tend to scale up really, really fast, having a clear breakdown of which brushes to use and how generally you can apply them can be absolutely essential for getting everyone on the same page as quick as possible. But also, if you're anything like me, you probably spend hours scrolling through all the brushes in Photoshop before your brain eventually just sort of collapses in on itself. So I usually just try and pick like 4 or 5 like for that day and just experiment with those and find out what I can really do with them before moving on to like the next bunch after that. And I would also recommend making your own brushes. It's freakishly quick and easy to get really decent results. Now in Photoshop, this sort of simple giraffe pattern one here was one I made just at some random point really early in and took about 10 minutes. You know, like to create it and then test it, and we ended up using it tons throughout the whole game. So yeah, the point being that like a tiny little bit of just R&D into your brushes, or like sort of you know, just research and development into your brushes can really can like really just pay huge dividends. So rendering and levels of detail. So a little further into pre-production, we started to develop the language for different levels of detail. Figuring out exactly how your concepts abstract down over Z depth as they get further away is a specific problem that you'll have to always solve in 2D games, where you place things in different Z depths in front of the camera, in front of a perspective camera, and sort of have to fake the perspective essentially in the paint. And it's actually a really interesting study to look at different sort of standout games over the past 20 years or so, and sort of look at how the same house is rendered, you know, in the foreground where the player is, and where the houses off into the background are sort of rendered. And actually, a lot of the fun old retro games that are up on the floor at the moment there'd be a good thing to look out for. It's just sort of like, you know, especially with those really old constrained games, technically. There's a house that you can walk into, and there's one off in the distance. It'll be like house in the distance will be like a triangle or a square or something, but your brain's still like, yep, houses. But yeah, for us, we eventually landed on a 3-tier system where levels 1, so sort of stage and stage back, would allow us to sort of populate the player space with detailed items that essentially have no parallax on them, or they sort of like they move at the same speed as the player, and then have a level 2 in the middle there, where some of the detail and line work would sort of be maintained, but the form would be kind of simplified a little bit. So you can see like on the handles for the car, for example, instead of having like two bits on the detail, just be like one, and then eventually just like a line essentially off in the distance. And yeah, so that level 3 at the back will be kept for just the simplest of forms, essentially abstract shapes in the background just to frame shots, again help with readability, also allow for larger landmarks like you can see here, which do tons for just like player orientation and like getting an idea for where you are and where you've been, but then they also just are really great for suggesting a wider world beyond the screen. So these images just summarize the rules we started to lay in place over a really short period of time pretty well, I thought. So this was just really early, quick test, just in a boat, just kind of working out, like, again, working out the style and the shapes and stuff. Just like a vague, Steamboat Willie sort of vibe one. Just really starting to kind of work out what it felt like initially. And then this was like a second stab, like a couple of days later. And although this doesn't sort of represent our visual style in the very end, I found this leap just like so interesting as a sort of gauge for how much character we managed to add in just such a short amount of time, with like just a few little tweaks in the right direction. And by about midway into pre-production, we made sure to include that sort of general first, second, and third layer of detail with all of our concepts and rendering tests, because it just gave us so much more bang for our buck as we were doing them. So sort of, fully explore out the entire range of how they would ultimately be used and shown in game. And sort of by practicing this, this sort of good practice as we went along, by the time we got to pre-production, we'd established so many more general rules of how our shapes and color behave, not just when they're, when Mickey's sort of standing right next to them, but when they were off in the distance and miles away. So it's really helpful. And then, just a side note, something I really recommend here, and you can kind of see it up there in the top, is when you're in this phase of developing visual styles with different brushes, write the brush name on the concept, and maybe just like hide that layer after you've done it. If it annoys you, because there's nothing more annoying than forgetting which brushes you've used, and then you can dig into the sort of metadata in Photoshop to just sort of find that, but it's like soul crushing and like work that nobody should ever be forced to do. And again, this might seem like a super basic tip, but I feel like knowing like 1,000 little tips like this results in being a Photoshop genius. So yeah, the sweet spot. This was one of those sort of breakthrough tests we did where all the levels of detail felt nearly there. There was the sort of perfect texture and volume on the leaves and the bark, nice specular brush on the chimney, and sort of the blocking shadows in the second layer, when sort of zoomed out, start to take on a really simple but still interesting balance. I don't know about any other artists in the room, but my breakthrough asset always seems to be a tree. And I think it's probably like a really important thing there to highlight, something that can be especially useful about developing an asset which all other assets then answer to. So like a god asset, if you will. And the humble tree is the perfect candidate for these assets. We have such an instinctive knowledge of trees and how they should look, as we do with the human anatomy, that you can't sort of do wrong as an environment artist, making a tree the cornerstone of your whole visual style and all your development. It kind of gives you that perfect canvas to get a good read on how your style's shaping up. And this is the asset that I ended up using as my sort of god asset on Illusion Island to sort of compare all my assets off of. And it's kind of a tree. It's basically a tree trunk, but it captures the heart of the game for me in one kind of little thing. Feels like a tree that Mickey Mouse would run along, for one. But like also the movement and the flowing lines, to me, like really complement the game design and the joy of movement. And in the sort of blocked colors at the bottom here, give that sort of nice faked perspective of sort of like the bottom kind of fading away or going off in the distance a little bit, but also like simplifying the style and keeping your attention on the top. So yeah, if you do find an asset like this that helps you understand your game style really succinctly and like the kind of the core, like the heart of it, don't ignore it. Hold all the others against it, and then consistency should follow. Yeah, and I'm sure some of you will have heard this before, that sort of like as a concept artist, 99% of your work gets thrown away, and that's kind of true. Or not thrown away. That sounds like violent, but like it's just not used. So many designs are unused. So many avenues are left unexplored. But I just want to dwell on them just for a minute because I still feel that they're really crucial. And although they're still sort of put aside, they can and do sort of influence the final project in a direct or indirect way, or just in really interesting ways, even if they aren't specifically selected. And they're also just fun to share. Like, we never get the chance to share this stuff. And it's just like, I just find it really fascinating to think of all the hundreds of ways that every game could have gone in, that they end up not going in. And I just find them fascinating to kind of see, and hopefully you all will as well. And like also with most of the sort of art of books, if you know those, the sort of books that like Disney and stuff release, as much as I love them and like collect them and devour them, they rarely kind of show me the really early, like the stuff that I want to see. 'Cause I feel like everyone wants to see the really weird stuff, like at the beginning, and I found like the consensus for that is kind of overwhelming. Like, but I will recommend the Art of Journey, if anyone knows that game at this point, because they did like a really, really good job of sort of showing everything from day one through to final thing and even afterwards. So yeah, shout out Journey. Contrast. So the power of contrast is something I'm absolutely fascinated by. I heard one of my favorite songwriters discuss it in terms of their songwriting choices several years ago when I was working on Battletoads. And sort of trying to keep an eye out for opportunities to use it has been just like a constant obsession since then. So in Illusion Island, I started noticing it starting to sort of emerge a little bit when I started placing Mickey in environments where the moon was out or at night. So instantly he felt like somewhere he just shouldn't be. He felt very, very vulnerable, and that's such an important feeling to be able to simulate to your players in games. If you feel vulnerable, you want to protect your character, and sort of by extension, you want to protect yourself. And yeah, the concept thumbnail here is very, very, very simple, but even just the contrast of Mickey out at night, the nice scale of the trees in comparison to him, and also like not being able to quite make out what's out in the background. I found it like really, really fun and successful as a sort of eerie environment for Mickey. And although we didn't sort of like action this direct concept, it was still like a useful piece to sort of refer to when we were sort of looking for wider opportunities to take Mickey into darker territory. So it's basically just a case of casting a wide net before reeling it in, to find the sort of perfect tone that complements your own story and your own gameplay in the way that feels right to you. And it's like a really great skill to hone to sort of be able to know when you've wandered off too far and need to turn back, or to just like be able to select the right amount of seasoning for whatever it is you're working on. This was like the darkest point that I could find that I went to in my concept art personally on Illusion Island. So I think the idea here was basically looking at creating an environment that was based on old folklore and mixed like the Lost Boys from Peter Pan with the Pied Piper. So the idea was that in this biome of the dead, which was one of our initial ones that we're developing, these kids lived in this like endless forest with these ghosts that lived in them that could lure you off, like the Pied Piper, and the inhabitants, like the children, would age as they were lured off. So the inhabitants of the forest, because of that, slept in these little cute tents that they like zipped closed every night, so they can't be lured away in their sleep. So yeah, super dark. but this like wasn't too much of a leap from the ideas we were doing sort of around about this time. But then once I did this, I was like, this is fun, but I've definitely gone too far for this like cute Mickey Mouse game. And something else I find really fascinating besides contrast that our brains absolutely love to see is, and like really responds to, is just when something looks like it has a sense of age to it. Like lots of concept artists take advantage of this, obviously, and it's basically the entire job of the Imagineers at Disneyland to sort of trick your brain into believing that a space has originally come about over decades, over hundreds of years, other than just being built last year sort of thing. Is kind of one of those tricks as an environment artist that you just like have to absolutely categorically have to get right. It'll all fall apart otherwise, and then people don't buy it, they don't buy the space, and so they don't get immersed, and so they don't enjoy the experience. So this environment in the game, this is quite an early concept, but actually takes place in a secret biome. So I won't do any spoilers. But basically, I really wanted this one to feel like the oldest of all of the biomes, and also that it was just inhabited by one person. So I tried to bring in a few different techniques to try and convey both of those things in this. First of all, I really liked the idea of a tower that that sort of didn't make sense or shouldn't be able to hold up itself, but somehow did. And I've been looking at a lot of the concept art for Coco, if anyone's seen that film. And I really liked how they have that sort of verticality and sort of allowed for the change in architectural styles over the sort of years, over the centuries as the technology evolved. And then finally, the top section here that you can see is inspired by brutalism, and specifically the architecture of Tadao Ando and Minoru Yamasaki. I find it like just really, really useful to look at different architects, civil engineering projects, and architectural movements sort of in general, just to sort of help emphasize certain moods, or in this case, to sort of mirror the psychological feeling of claustrophobia and imprisonment that the solo inhabitant of this world sort of struggles with. This one actually made it into the final game, even though I convinced myself it never would. So in our engineering biome, you fight a boss battle at the end, and I really wanted this to feel like the crescendo, the sort of finale of, because it is, of our over-engineered Rube Goldberg world that I mentioned. That the player had just sort of gone through, and I thought it would be really funny if we just made it the inside of the Nintendo Switch. Because what's more engineering than the device that the whole thing exists on? And I just enjoyed it as like a little Easter egg in case any players who are like into like tech or soldering or anything just sort of stumbled across it and was like, nice reward. This is like this is a very small niche example, of course. But like I presented this talk internally to Dlala, to the studio last week, and our lead playtester hadn't realized that that's what this was, and he like absolutely lost it. Like he just because he just sits on the Switch all day, obviously. And when I told him this, he was just like, it was great. But despite that being very small niche, there is something, I think, to adding little types of value for different types of player to enjoy. Like this is essentially an Easter egg, but I really do like to look for just opportunities like this to invite different types of players in. If you've ever played any old point and click games, I think a few of which will probably be upstairs hopefully, and sort of waited around the room for a mouse to come out, or for an NPC to say something to you like, what are you waiting here for, you'll know what I'm talking about. Like it's such a nice little easy hack to just add some realism and some believability to your world in a fun way. It often doesn't take that much work, and for the players who do sort of like to just stop and smell the flowers, it goes a really long way. So these are like really specific to our studio environment, but I still wish someone had sort of just like highlighted them or pointed them out to me before I moved into sort of like a full-time position, so that I'd sort of been exposed to them somehow. And like every project will have these issues. Usually after every project, we'll do like a what they call like a post-mortem, which is an awful phrase, but like like a review, which is essentially just therapy for everyone who's just worked on the game, so that they can kind of discuss what went wrong on the project, what do we need to do better next time, and like most importantly, like what solutions do we have to fix this. So these are some of the ones that I basically just like raised at the end of Illusion Island, and just sort of a little bit about them. So the first one is sort of not taking full advantage of pre-production, of sort of and our engine tests. Like it's really important that in this sort of precious time you have in pre-production to really spend the time working out the style guide, like I said, but also to really start to get stuff into the game, and to sort of get as good an idea of like the full breadth of the game as you can. So like for example, we have this underwater level, but we didn't explore what our underwater levels looked like at all in our game until we were actually making it, and it was a bit of a it was just 10 times harder than it should have been otherwise, because we were doing it against the clock rather than in this nice chunk of pre-production we had. And just by inevitably putting stuff in the engine, like it might look great in Photoshop, you put it in the engine, it's like it's the worst thing ever. It just doesn't work. So it's really helpful. Next one is sort of like basically developing too much of our artwork without design being involved, and then sort of vice versa. The department's been too not being synchronized enough. Like world building is such a huge part of pre-production, and everyone loves it, so everyone should be as involved as they can, and it means that everyone's sort of on the same page in terms of expectations. Like the art team could go and develop a whole bunch of stuff, and then could come to the design team, and turns out none of that doesn't it doesn't line up. It's like, oh, we can't actually do this because we want to do this, yada yada. Design could come to art and say, like, we want to do this, and art's like, oh well, we'd hoped we could do it this way. It's really something we're focused on now, is sort of on getting better at. Is synchronizing the departments as well as possible, and getting sort of everyone around the table for world building. Communication within the art team. For us, that meant we'd have our art director who sort of oversaw everything, but the artwork itself went from concept through to production, through to thumbnail art, and through to implementation. Like it went through all of these steps, and it sort of becomes like this kind of like like broken telephone kind of thing, where like little bits of detail can kind of get lost throughout, and then by the time it hits the end, someone from the start could see it and then be like, oh, this isn't what I meant at all. This is like something's gotten lost in translation here. So just we're looking for opportunities to, and think it's really important to just look for opportunities to sort of kind of keep as much people's eyes on things as possible, and like have that sort of ownership within the team. Fourth one, not leaving enough time for lighting and post-processing. I will sort of touch on this a little bit later. But yeah, these sort of non-tactile complementary sort of parts are usually the first to go. Game development pipelines are very, very, very tight often, and like things will just get cut whenever there's like any sort of compromise on like the core vision. So definitely want to take those kind of things which are really important into account as early as you can. But yeah, I'll touch on this in a second. The last one seems really obvious, just play testing. But like in studios, the QA department or the quality assurance department exists to playtest the game and exists for a reason. And they're fantastic, and you should take full advantage of them. But the specific the specific relationship that you as a developer and as an artist develop with the game itself as it's sort of being developed through just playtesting it regularly is like that's like a strict rule that you should keep to. It's so easy to sort of like push the playtest ahead a week, and sort of like other things to be done, but like there's some things just shouldn't be cut, and one of them is just regularly playtest, and both alone and with other members of the team. So like if that's one thing that's to take away, that'll keep you right throughout your career. And then in our production concept art, so this was the art that was directly being taken and then turned into production art, which goes into the game. I highly recommend breaking up this concept art stage into component kits to better understand it to form your art kit. So in our production art kit, like I can't tell you how to create sort of like good art kit TM. As each game is bespoke, but brains and tend to like compartmentalization and things being broken down, or at least mine really does. My brain just turns to jelly if I try to sort of picture everything together at once. So splitting your concept art up into here, so we've got floors here, obviously. So you can see our floors here from our astronomy biome, and mechanics was another one. So here you can see sort of some concepts for our airstream mechanics and our engineering biome. So we've got some like vinyl, jet turbine, and a hairdryer, which is the one we opted for. So just your usual stuff. Hazards in our game. So you can see here some static hazards, also from our engineering biome. Some platforms for our engineering biome. So we had lots of different types of platforms in our game, and sort of breaking those all down and having individual focus on each of them, just on their own, developing them was really useful as well. So yeah, naturally we've got a car park barrier, a letterbox, Scotch tape, all the good stuff. I think the letterbox and the barrier were the two that got picked, I think. And then background and foreground shapes was really, really useful as well. Although they're very, very simple, but again, having that palette and like specifically calling out these was really useful. And then finally, set dressing. So this is some set dressing from the hub world in our game, where the Hokins, who you hopefully remember from the trailer, the little sort of hamster rabbit things, they live amongst the Grand Library, which you would have seen in the trailer as well. So for them, like some props around sort of enjoying culture and the arts and the finer things felt like that more relaxing pace of life for them was really fun. But yeah, another like essential separate part to sort of call out. And the set dressing, here's some more from Hub World, is always the most fun because it's just essentially like untethered world building, free from any sort of parameters, really, from the mechanics, the platforms and hazards and everything. They have very specific utilities, but this is just like, you're essentially illustrating a book almost. It's just like, what do we want in this world? It'll be great. Or like even our floors had very, very specific technical limitations. But yeah, hopefully you can spot some of our sort of core signature shapes from some of the earlier work in this more sort of like latter stage work here. But yeah, those are the ones that worked for us. Okay, so just excuse me for a minute, because this is sort of my like get up on my soapbox kind of part, because this is one of the sort of biggest challenges I've had is sort of validating, communicating out on the games I've worked on post-processing. Artists inherently understand the power of the vibes. It doesn't need to be explained to them. If anything, we're probably too obsessed with them, but it's because we just know their value. Players absolutely love them as well. And yeah, I keep saying vibes obviously, but I'm just talking about post-processing. Grain, vignette, color grading, bloom, all those things that take the digital artwork and make it not feel like it was made in Photoshop, basically. It brings life into the mix, it brings some warmth into the artwork. They're hugely, hugely important. But sometimes non-artists, and even like artist members of the team, can be really, really reluctant at the thought of adding them because they're historically very expensive for one, in terms of they use up a lot of memory. And then they obviously have their own downsides and pitfalls, such as accessibility issues, affecting readability, and if sort of used haphazardly, they can affect readability really badly. Or even like I'm sure folk here have like had too much motion blur on or something on the game, and it's just been like, this is horrible. There are huge downsides as well. If you're not, So it's essential that you sort of you just use it subtly. But for me, it's like really important to just sort of bake all of these into the concept art initially. So I'll specifically call out and emphasize the subtle ways that we'll maybe want to use post-processing, and like why that will push the quality bar up and like help the aesthetic. But yeah, so the reason I do that is because game projects are really malleable in pre-production. They've got a lot of give. But then as you get further and further towards deadlines and towards shipping, they just start to become more solid forms, and you can't sort of everything's kind of become set in stone at a certain point. So, for example, if the visual style that you're developing, and I saw a lot of really cool visual styles upstairs that were sort of tied into this really nicely, actually, a lot of really nice sort of lo-fi throwback kind of aesthetics. But yeah, if you're developing a game that needs like a touch of analog qualities, for example, like maybe there's a game you're making that takes place in the 90s, so you want to have like a light, very subtle grain on it, maybe like a little warble or something like that. Just to be reminiscent of that time period, not in a ham-fisted way, but like just as a sort of as an in to the aesthetic, to sort of give players a better idea of the tone and where you're coming from. I don't know if any of you played Crow Country, which is a new game that came out very recently, obviously, and they're like a really, really good example of a game that's done this really interestingly. So yeah, the note here just being basically put it in the concept art, put your post-processing in your concept art, and specifically write notes how and why it's important. Really get everyone on board, show the difference with and without the effect, and how sort of like if we go with it, like look how this raises the bar for the entire game, and then just sort of really fight your corner on post-processing, because it is hugely sort of underappreciated, like as a tool for that reason, and with a lot of things, people just don't know it till they see it a lot of the time. And this is the example I really like to use on sort of the importance of this and the subtlety of this. So this is, as I'm sure some of you will be aware, this is from Cuphead, which obviously like very, very incredible game, and very heavy-handed with the way it sort of utilizes a very extremely but like surgical approach to the vibes. So naturally, Cuphead's entire goal was to simulate a time when the animation celluloid was photographed on very primitive aperture cameras, with tons of grain, and like the actual physical properties and machinery that these old cartoons were sort of filmed with and made on had to be felt and had to be like at the core of the entire experience. So yeah, this is the Cuphead we know and love, vibes and all. And then this is without post-processing. So like still absolutely beautiful, right? But like just in a different league of success in terms of its aesthetic, and the sort of the feeling and the atmosphere. So yeah, hopefully this illustrates the importance of post-processing and sort of help you think about it maybe in other ways in your own work. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight some sort of things just really quickly with regards to portfolios. In case you're looking to work in the games industry or even studios sort of like Dlala, I can sort of tell you exactly what we look for as a studio, more or less. The first one is very obvious, is a love of traditional stylized 2D broadcast animation, and sort of how it's made. This is at the heart of everything we do. You saw that in like what Battletoads is all about, it was what Illusion Island was all about. So if that's apparent in the applications we receive, it's usually a sign immediately. That's like through the first gate, it's like, oh, this person's in the right place. They clearly love this stuff as much as we do. Second one, more controversial, but like comes with a huge caveat of, you don't want to have endless fan art in your art portfolios, but like a little bit of fan art that shows how you've been playful with like reinterpreting an IP, or like a franchise, something like for what we did with Mickey Mouse. Maybe you've adjusted the world building, maybe you've taken the characters or the worlds and you've reinvented it. You've sort of shown like, oh, like I want to make a Zelda game, but for for like a much younger audience. And so here's the shape language, here's the designs, here's the that sort of stuff is exactly what we do. Like that's our bread and butter. Like, that's what we do every day. It's like it's that's really, really, really great for us to see specifically our studio, and like, but that applies to any studios that you see working with well-known sort of franchises. Next one, we're a Unity studio, Unity game engine. So seeing like this is a very easy one for applicants. It's sort of even shown that you've taken like a day or two. You know, like Unity is very, very accessible, especially for artists right now, and just showing that you've taken the incentive and the time to just pick up Unity and learn like the absolute basics of it, like immediately, you're, you know, huge win, very huge, easy win. The last one's kind of harder to sort of like define, but I do feel it's like really, really important for us specifically. Like having a strong foundational art sort of awareness and skill set is obviously extremely important. That's sort of like step one. But we do like to push a lot of our artwork in the same ways that sort of like Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network approached a lot of their stuff that they did sort of in the 90s and the early 90s. So that's to say like underpinning everything with that solid art foundation, but leaving tons and tons of room to push warp and twist those foundational rules of like things like perspective, color, shape, in ways that bring out really fun, unique visual identities that people remember for years to come. Thanks very much. That's me. Also, I should probably just say we are like on the floor right now upstairs. If anyone wants to play Illusion Island, it's like literally set up, so you can go and speak to Luke, and he'll give you a good demo of the game. And also, one of our designers, Liam, who may or may not be in this room, is doing a talk at 2 o'clock on the top floor up by Pizza Express. Shout out Pizza Express. So yeah, I would highly recommend that. It's a really, really fascinating talk. Does anyone have any questions at all?
You have a really like strong visual style, and it was really interesting. I've got just for some context, I'm interested in sort of the 2D animation side of things, which I guess is similar. And I was just curious, how do you sort of, for example, with the house, you had a sense of depth and things, whilst also keeping it obviously flat. So how do you sort of do that, I guess? How do you keep things sort of, give them a sense of depth while keeping them 2D, I guess?
Yeah, so that's kind of, that ties in really nicely to the last point I made about being playful with things like perspective. A lot of our visual styles are like very, very flat because, like I say, we're looking to a lot of things like the, you know, shows like Dexter's Lab and Hey Arnold and all these sort of iconic shows, and sort of that Saturday morning cartoon heart that they kind of like, you know, that vibe that they created. And they sort of kind of like they demonstrate that, you know, they sort of show how you can use perspective to your advantage even when it doesn't make any sense, you know. So there's a very clear break line that you sort of realize as an artist where if I push this perspective like this far, it's like, oh, it feels great, it feels really appealing, I can make this work with where it is. But like there's like a fine line where you push it too far and you're like, oh, it's broken, like it doesn't work anymore, it looks weird, you know. And that little sweet spot there is sort of where we like, well, that's where we operate in. So that's usually like the mindset.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Do you find it difficult to create a new style for existing IP? Like obviously Disney has a massive, Mickey Mouse, for example, has his own style. Were you given a lot of reference, or were you kind of encouraged to develop this new style? Yeah. We were like, the good thing was that Disney was very encouraging for us to like they wanted to lean into the fact that we were like a small studio that did this specific like style of games, you know, that not a huge amount of people are doing. But then, yeah, like as well, very excitingly, they gave us like full access to the art archives when we first started working on it, which like as someone who likes Disney artwork and, you know, film and stuff, and like as an artist, that was just like, you know, it was just like, oh, this is cool. So being able to sort of really get a full comprehensive understanding of like, okay, here's the parameters of where Mickey exists in, you know, here's like the worlds that he exists in, here's the tones that sort of make sense of Mickey. And like a lot of Mickey cartoons, you know, like do go very dark, or they go very surreal, or like especially lately, if you've watched any of the newer Mickey cartoons, you know, really, really interesting visual styles and sort of themes. So yeah, like that was being aware of like keeping something like the catchphrase we sort of had in the studio was, I think it was like, authentically Disney, distinctly Dlala, you know. So it had to like have those pillars, was like kind of the like that we would bounce everything off of, if that answers the question. Yeah. Awesome, cool. Oh. Is there time for more? Okay, as long as there's time.
No, I was just gonna say, loved your talk. It was really great.
Thank you.
The stuff about post-processing was spot on, and we have that ourselves at our studio where, you know, sometimes we actually just talk the client through PSD at the end.
Oh,
We
nice.
go through the post-processing.
Yeah.
So we do that ourselves. But yeah, and my question is going to be really similar to Brennan's here, but just that kind of like, it's really great to hear that that Disney were just like very open to you just experiment with Mickey, like their flagship character. I you know, anytime we've had run-ins with Disney, they've been like, and understandably so, like quite protective. So like,
Yeah.
you guys, but yeah, just in terms of like your like, do you have any pushback ever with how extreme the style is? Because you know, looking at like Battletoads as well, like, I love that when you guys were doing that too. Like it's odd to me. It doesn't take much for you guys to stand out in a crowd, like just doing something slightly different.
Yeah.
Like you've made a name for yourselves with this style.
Yeah.
Part that must be because that the studio, the industry in general doesn't really take risks in this sense. But have you had any pushback with like Microsoft with Battletoads, or they like this is too much, or?
Yeah, there's probably a certain amount of detail I probably can't go into with that stuff.
Yeah.
But no, like it's really interesting. Like it's very interesting. Disney, like I said, Disney were like surprisingly very kind of chill with that kind of stuff, because they are, you know, Mickey Mouse is essentially them. You know, it's like their core thing. You know, is the mouse, and so going into it, you know, there was kind of like a pre-assumption or an assumption of you know, this will be every line and every color will be like closely scrutinized, but they intentionally sort of came to us because they wanted, like, what will a small sort of weird little studio do with this? You know, like, let's just back off for a while, see what sort of happens. And I think they did that. And, you know, obviously they did have tons and tons of feedback and loads of stuff that was changed and sort of stuff, but it always felt like they got it, you know, like it always felt like they got it, and the feedback was like, keep doing what you're doing, and also like think about this as well. So it was never sort of like, ooh, you know, like from what I remember, obviously I wasn't privy to every conversation, but like, but yeah, and then likewise working with Rare was kind of the same. They specifically greenlit the pitch because we were like, we saw this game as a 90s, like as a you know, when we played this game pixel art style, it was like in our imaginations it was like a Saturday morning cartoon, like that's how it felt, you know, looking like so like that was our sort of pitch, and like this sort of surreal sort of bent to it was kind of just what was like a really interesting part of it for us, and they just responded to that. So it's kind of like, you know, it took the pitch to happen in a certain way that just really got them excited, which then led to the thing. You know, we could have pitched a much safer game, and they might have loved that as well, but luckily they liked the kind of strange vision for it that we had, which was fun.
Awesome. I was just ask, how do you deal with scaling of assets when you presumably you did do the production artwork, or did you? Yeah, I mean, how do you make sure everything looks right on the screen in terms of scale and everything?
Yeah.
Because there's so many different resolution things you do accommodate, especially if you're working on PC, of course. So
Yeah.
How do you factor that in?
So for scaling, we actually during pre-production we had a sort of slightly our art style. And I think this is kind of what you're getting at, but like a lot of our style was kind of very like it was a bit too detailed, you know. So when it was on the Switch screen, it was kind of all of a sudden was like, whoa, there's just too much stuff here, you know. So like having to take into account both that folk were going to be playing it on like the Switch and also like potential screens like this is like a hilarious problem that like folk in games just didn't have, you know. Like you were never taking a direct port of like Tony Hawk's 2 on the Game Boy and putting it on a projector screen, you know. No one ever did that, so it was like, it looks good in the Game Boy, get out of the door, you know. But like yeah, so like that was like an ongoing thing that we had to constantly sort of check. Yeah, and yeah, I think that's about all I can think of.
I understand there's probably a technical side to it as well.
There's a big technical side that's probably less of my kind of wheelhouse. But yeah, we definitely chat about that a bit more after. If you see me around, I'll try and our technical artist is here, so I can point you in his direction, and he'll have some.
As well, yeah, but we covered a lot of stuff apart from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Awesome. Cool. I'm aware we've gone quite a bit over now, but thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I really appreciate it.